A simple thing is that of course in a day like this there is a lot of new information coming and people get it in their heads, but if we can express it in our bodies, we absorb it in different ways, and what we learn is that we need to connect all of people's attention and all of them things to connect with the world that we do. And it's interesting that within the tree diversity and the spiritual, emotional link on that, it works pretty well on people. So it's partly a trick to keep the audience awake, but partly also to make sure we do connect with the things beyond the only hearing the theory and the words.
And trees do seem to have that kind of effect on people. All around the world there's immense affection for trees. In India they're regarded as sacred, and I'm sure in a lot of other places around the world. So why do we have this problem with declining forest numbers? If you look at the figures, they seem absolutely terrifying, the amount of hectares that are lost on a daily basis.
Well, part of that is that the concept forest was created outside of people. We've created an artificial concept of forest that in its tradition excludes people from it. And in many areas in Indonesia we see, we say the trees walk out of the forest. There are less and less trees in the forest, and there are more and more trees outside and on the farms. And so there's nothing wrong with the relation between people and trees, but there have been many challenges in the relation between forest and local communities, and we need reforming the way we think about forest and the way forest would exclude people from, and we need to learn. So to some extent the problem is not with the trees, but the problem is with the forest, and we can't see the forest for the trees or the other way around.
Well, there are no walking trees, as I know, rather like Lord of the Rings and the giant Ents that walked out. But in terms of people's relationship with trees and what can be done to protect trees, what's your organisation working on? What are you Are you aiming from an educational point of view? Is that the best way to engage with people?
Well, I mean, we are a research organisation, so we're primarily about knowledge generation, knowledge sharing, and working. Once there are policy commitments to get something done, we can help to see how it can be done, but we are not setting the targets, we're helping on implementing it. The main program from which we're coming out here is connecting the people who work on forest, who work on tree diversity, who work on the agroforestry. We now have this joint program, and we have what we call this forest transition or tree cover transition. We see in landscapes there are parts where there's rapid deforestation, there are parts where there is a clear lack of trees and where there should be more trees, and there are parts of landscapes where trees are coming back and people are planting trees and benefiting from them. And we are very interested in how these different things connect. And so far we've had separate programs dealing with the forest on this side and dealing with agroforestry on the other side. And we do feel that we need to connect the pieces. And to some extent the drivers of the problem on one hand are often coming from the other part. So yeah, the interesting news is we have found new ways to cooperate between the different research organizations, and we've been signing here new agreements with the CBD Secretariat and others to make sure that this type of science and knowledge gets linked up with the policy frames that happen. And in this CBD we have all the targets and we have objectives and we have many programs, but it's short of implementation. And hopefully we can help on connecting with new innovative ways of achieving these targets and connecting our science with the policy and the practitioners. So we are, with all of this talk about applied science versus upstream science, we try to do both, and maybe try to work on the cutting edge of the science at the same time. We want to work on issues that have real policy platforms and where there is a chance to communicate results out and get them applied.
What parts of the world, which and I know that the World Agroforestry Centre works in many parts of the world. What parts of the world give you optimism? What make you think, well, actually, we might be getting it right here?
Well, in a big way, of course, anyone who remembered the way people talked about India, Indonesia as lost cases in terms of poverty, hunger, whatever. in the 1960s, we'll see, if you see now, there's no comparison between that. So in a big way, of course, Asia has turned the corner on basic issues of food production and poverty, and has many challenges left on the environmental side, but is getting there. And by and large, Africa was the basket case where everything went wrong. I think there's increasingly areas within Africa where things are, where we've started to turn the corner. So in Latin America, by and large, well, there are big issues on the social side, big issues on the policy side and on the sharing, but overall, people have moved forward. So, but it is very interesting to be able to connect work in these different continents and share learnings between. And I think by and large things are much more dynamic than people think and see. If you look on the time scale of 20, 30 years, then there's a lot of reason for optimism.
Is there also as big a problem with industrial plantations of trees which just have the same trees in that particular area, thereby destroying any kind of biodiversity? I don't know what the singular word for biodiversity is, but you know, just when you have one species of tree, monocultures, so you just have pine trees for pine furniture. Is that a sort of equal problem to some degree, particularly I'm thinking in Northern Europe where you have these huge pine forests?
Well, yeah, and I mean in Northern Europe, for reasons of biogeography, the tree diversity is quite low anyway, and there are areas where monocultures may actually even be the natural vegetation. But a big thing, of course, is the expansion of oil palm that we've seen in Indonesia, Malaysia, as replacing very rich forest, but also very rich agroforestry systems, and we're quite engaged in that discussion about it and quantifying what's going on there. Partly these things are, let's say, part of it is that there is some real economic benefit in oil palm. Happens to be a very productive tree, so the more oil palm you have, the more you can get. But partly is also perception and policies that are favoring the large plantations and not giving a fair chance to the local small producers. Small producers would never go for a monoculture. They would always go for, never put all their eggs in one basket. They are much more inclined to manage risk by maintaining diversity on farm. And that debate on oil palm, I mean, there's nothing wrong with oil palm as a species, but there is a lot wrong if you go from wall to wall and get to create monocultures. Sorry.
And in your presentation, you used an interesting analogy, because a lot of the talk here and in the climate talks too is about we know the price of everything, but the value of nothing. Yeah. And you mentioned elephants. I think they were Javan elephants. Remind people who might be watching this. Give them a taste of your analogy and why you think it's relevant.
Well, yeah, it's an interesting twist of how our human valuing of the elephants that we find on the island of Borneo has shifted over the last 10 years. So elephants occur in Sumatra and mainland Southeast Asia, but there are no elephants on Borneo from natural causes. Yet there are populations of elephants in the northern side of Borneo and in the state of Sabah. And they do a fair amount of damage to the forest and the places where they walk. So people say they are invasive exotics. These elephants don't belong here, we should get rid of them. Then biologists looked at the DNA of these elephants, and they found actually they are different from the Southeast Asia elephant. And it was described as a new species. They are now called the pygmy elephants. And as soon as they were recognized as a separate species, they were put on the red list of being the most threatened elephant species on Earth that we have, and it wasn't quite clear where they come from. Now, the latest twist in that story, and that still needs some final confirmation, but it seems a very credible story, is that these actually are the only survivors of the Java elephants. The island of Java had its own elephants. They got extinct in around 15th century, but some of them had been sent by the courts in Java to the courts in Borneo and had escaped from there. So we now talk about an ex situ conservation of an otherwise extinct species. interesting enough, these elephants haven't changed over the last 10 years. They still do the same amount of damage to the forest and the places where they walk around. But our human valuation of that is changing quite a lot with the twist to that story. The point is that for many of our species, we don't know these stories, or we're just discovering them right now. And so, we say, and we try to put value on it, but we see that every twist and turn in that story, our concept of valuation has changed quite a lot. So it is sort of a plea to get more depth and get more research on these topics.
And going back to the trees, but staying with that point on diversification, builds resilience. Is there enough diversification when it comes to tree species around the world, or is that an increasing worry? I read recently that there is I think it's an ash disease in Denmark that perhaps is spreading across Europe. I'm not sure if it's the ash tree, but I think it was. But is that a worry for you, that tree species are being so, we're just using the same seeds and the same particular species, that they will, as a result of that, be weak if there is an illness?
Yeah, and I think the story is with the fractions, with the ash, or no, is it the elm or the ash? I'm not quite sure. I guess it's the elm in the UK that actually was introduced in the Roman times, but from a very narrow genetic base. So basically, all the elms that you had come from a very narrow base, and you can say that for 2,000 years has not been a problem, and now suddenly there's a disease going through on it. We've seen the same with whenever any single tree species was identified. So we had this Lucina as the wonder trees in the 1970s, and everyone started planting from, again, a narrow genetic base, and the pest and disease came up and wiped it out. So at the same time, it is a matter of, from economic side of risk, and if it goes well for 50 years, then people don't care about it. But we see, if you look at rubber and oil palm, rubber was introduced in Asia from Latin America, again from a very narrow genetic base, and it has gone pretty well over time. So yes, there are many cases where it has gone wrong, and yet there are enough cases where people have benefited from it. Clearly our story from the agroforestry side is to appreciate diversity and manage it well, and with anything about climate change and increasing uncertainty, we're better off at maintaining diversity where we can, and getting to know what the diversity is. There's interesting work at the moment on let's say, the domestication of trees. And in the past, you would think, okay, the scientists go out and find the best tree, and then they multiply and give it to the people and that plant. No, by far the most successful things is where, in many different parts of the landscape, farmers have collected local tree material. And then we see in trees that the diversity on farm is still about as high as the diversity within the natural vegetation, and that we think is a much healthier way forward. So that domestication should not be done by the scientist and then brought to the farm. It should be done in the landscape and with the people who know about it. And we can't separate the biological side from the people side. We need to handle that jointly and manage it jointly.